Good evening, everyone, and a very warm welcome to this book discussion. This evening, we will present a conversation on the extremely critical issue of women's labor raised in Orient Black Swan's important recent publication, Laboring Women, Issues and Challenges in Contemporary India. We know that in emerging economies such as India, the gender gap in paid work has only increased in recent years. Official definitions of work and employment undermine women's labor, and despite the supposed development, policy changes, and talk of equality, the challenges faced by laboring women have multiplied, both in the context of paid and unpaid labor, in homes and outside. The advent of a neoliberal era may have worsened the situation, as the structural changes it brought in led to a significant decline in formal employment and contributed to the already overwhelming informality, which may have impacted women's work even more adversely. This important volume is the first of its kind to focus on various conceptual and methodological issues around women's work. The contributing authors, all highly regarded in their fields, examine key issues faced by women, such as the dichotomy between paid and unpaid work, women and land rights in India, the real effect of policy reforms on the public workforce, among many others. All of these and much more will be talked about during this evening's discussion. Before we move on to today's discussion, I would like to briefly introduce our panelists. I shall begin with the editors of this volume. Professor Praveen Shah is Professor of Economics at the Center for Economic Studies and Planning and adjunct professor at the Center for Informal Sector and Labor Studies, School of Social Sciences, JNU. His major areas of research and teaching include political economy of development, with particular reference to labor, agriculture, natural resources, public finance, education, and history of economic thought. Professor Avinash Kumar is Assistant Professor at the Center for Informal Sector and Labor Studies, School of Social Sciences, JNU. His major areas of research and teaching include the politics of marginalization and informality, social movements, the urban labor market, and political economy of development. Professor Yamini Mishra is Regional Director, South Asia Regional Office of Amnesty International's International Secretariat. Now, today we are delighted to have Professors Jha and Kumar with us. Also on the panel are Professor Nivedita Menon, who will be chairing the event today. Professor Menon teaches at the Center for Comparative Politics and Political Theory at JNU and is a widely published author, most recently of Saying Like a Feminist. Professor Indrani Majumdar, who retired as Senior Fellow at the Center for Women's Development Studies, New Delhi in 2020. Her research focus has been on gender, labor, migration in India, and she too has published widely on these themes. Professor Asha Kapoor Mehta, who is the Chairperson, Center for Gender Studies at the Institute for Human Development, Delhi, and Professor Sumangala Damodaran, who is a Professor of Economics, Development Studies, and Popular Music Studies at Ambedkar University, Delhi. Her research and publications fall broadly within the rubric of industrial and labor studies, and more specifically on industrial organization, global value chains, the informal sector, labor, and migration. He is also a singer and composer. A very warm welcome to you, professors, and thank you very much for being a part of this panel today. I shall now hand over the discussion to Professor Menon and request her to start the evening's proceedings.
Thank you.
You got muted, Nivedita.
Yes, I got muted. Starting again. So thank you very much. And we're all looking forward to the panel. And I'm very, very pleased to be part of the release of this fine volume of essays around the question of women and labor. So as you know, we have a panel coming up who will set up a stimulating discussion around different aspects of the book. So in my capacity as chair of this session, I will just give you a very brief introduction to what the book is about. So this is a collection of 12 essays that approaches the question, the central concern of the volume of women and labor. One could say largely from the disciplinary perspective of economics, But as is inevitable with all feminist scholarship, there is a way in which other disciplines, sociology, politics, history, make their presence felt and inflect the arguments. The first essay could in fact be said to come from cultural studies, with Mary John drawing on women's life narratives to reflect on labor. And that's the first essay in the book. And the final essay in the book is by Anita Gurumurthy on the question of the commons in the context of asserting digital commons in an era of data capitalism. So discipline-wise, it covers really quite a wide range of perspectives. And the other essays in between take up a range of issues, which will be discussed as we go along, from ranging from what Jayati Ghosh calls time poverty to care work and unpaid work, women domestic labor, women domestic workers, land rights and common property resources, and the role of public investment in promoting women's livelihood. The two essays by Sumi Krishna and Smita Gupta on land rights are, personally, I found them very, very interesting from the point of view of demonstrating the shift in feminist thinking from demanding land rights for individual women to recognizing the need to stress community ownership of resources in the face of rampant land acquisition for ecologically unsustainable and inequitable capitalist growth. So the shift from individual land rights for women to community rights is a really significant shift in feminist scholarship. So this is, as you know, from this very brief introduction, you can see this is a rich and multifaceted volume, and I congratulate the editors and authors on it. I now call upon Avinash Kumar, our first panelist, one of the editors of the volume, to tell us about the vision behind this project.
Thank you, Nive. Thank you so much for agreeing to chair this evening, and also for making my job a little bit easy, the way you describe the book and the chapters and the contributors. So let me begin by actually thanking each and every contributor who actually made this volume possible. And I would like to name each one of them in the order as they're placed in the chapters, starting with, as Nivi pointed out, Mary John, Jayati Ghosh, Vinoj Abraham, Churachri Das Gupta, Isha Ralli, Mohit Gupta, N. Neeta, Archana Prasad, S. Kriti, Ritu Diwan, Nisha Srivastav, Anjor Bhaskar, Kanika Kaul, Shaumya Srivastav, Sumi Krishna, Smita Gupta, and Anita Gurumurthy. Each of these contributors have brought in a wide range of issues critical to the understanding of women's world of work. The idea of this volume actually was conceptualized in 2013 with the organization of an international conference on the issues of women, work, and resources at the Center for Informal Sector and Labor Studies in association with UN Women. So from its conceptualization in 2013 to its dissemination today in 2021, actually, we have almost crossed a decade. And more importantly, this decade has also witnessed a deadly COVID-19 pandemic, which has exposed the consequences of the widening socioeconomic inequities in the dominant capitalist developmental paradigm, particularly the precarity prevailing in the world of work as a whole, and those among women, in particular. I, however, see a silver lining into it. And I see it as that COVID-19 pandemic has raised renewed concerns about inequality globally. So while the book might not have any reference to the pandemic and its aftermath, directly, readers will find that the authors in their chapters actually had alerted towards the crisis that were witnessed during the pandemic in many ways. That the notions of work and employment in official data set, data systems still continues to undermine women's work is well acknowledged. But there are troubling conceptual and empirical challenges with respect to recognition and measurement of a great deal of women's invisible work. And as was pointed out in the introduction, the structural changes brought in the neoliberal era have led to a significant decline in the formal employment and contributed to the already overwhelming informality, which has impacted the world of women's work even more adversely. Laboring Women, with its 12 chapters, is an attempt to explore these unfavorable trends and analyze the current position and condition of women's work. The volume begins with a major concern, as pointed out by Nivi, of understanding the interface between women's question and the labor question. And the first chapter by Mary John argues that the problem of women's labor is not one of absence or loss, but that it suffers from a remarkable degree of ideological, disciplinary, and thematic compartmentalization. John attempts to identify some of the sources of the problem and examine why a more multivalent analysis has proved so elusive in the Indian context. She asks a very pertinent question, whether the labor theory of value can be applied upon different women at all, or is it the stigma theory of work that should be used as a theoretical framework? The second chapter by Jayati Ghosh discusses women's work in relation to time poverty, and she shows that the value is extracted from women in terms of the extraction of social time. Thus, time poverty is in fact crucial to the understanding of the extraction of absolute surplus value through the extension of the working day of all women. The volume then goes on to engage further with the methodological and conceptual issues in studying and measuring women's work. Methodological issues in the study of the world of women's work here are not confined to the critiques of large-scale datasets. The volume, through the chapters by John and Ritudevan, makes some progress by accepting preference for methods such as life histories, case studies, and ethnographies in order to make women sell themselves and thereby unpack between different factors like caste, class. The contextualization of the peasant woman in the larger picture of materialist can also be found in the chapter by discussing the common. A number of chapters to understand the interlinkages between paid and unpaid work and the theoretical problems of domesticity clearly emerges as a common theme. For example, Vinod Abraham outlines the hierarchy and power relations within the family and his main analytical framework. And Nita and chapters by Archana Prasad and S. Kirti explore the different aspects associated with the embeddedness of the household within the larger economy and within the process of accumulation. Within this framework, they clearly establish that the household clearly becomes a site for the penetration of capital and is integrated into the labor markets through paid domestic work. The institutional aspects of this process are noted by Chirashri Das Gupta, Ishar Ali, and Mohit Gupta by explaining the ways in which customs are codified. For example, the taxation system and its link with the Hindu undivided family. These chapters also discuss how macroeconomic factors influence forms of patriarchy and cultural attitudes. The volume also engages in many ways with the current employment trends and the feminization debate. And it cautions to the readers that it has to be seen in a holistic manner. Nisha Srivastava and Anjor Bhaskar points toward the first obvious trend about the lack of paid employment in the labor market, which influences the increase in unpaid women's work in agriculture. This trend is also evident in the chapter by Nita, which shows that the unpaid work in self-employment is largely done by women and that there is no decline in women's labor force participation if unpaid and paid work is counted together. And thus, as Jayati Ghosh argues in her chapter, the drudgery of women's work cannot be understood without understanding this context. The persistent informality with respect to women's work ensures that most women are concentrated in low-paid work, which is invisible in large data sets. Further, the question of informality cannot be merely confined to the question of visibility. It also points toward a certain set of labor relations that structures the deteriorating position of women, as pointed out by Das Gupta and the co-authors. That women form a bulk of workforce that contributes to the economy is well established by the essays in this volume, but it is also acknowledged that the macroeconomic large-scale datasets do not show this because they only consider paid work in the calculation of labor force participation rates. The essays here demystify this and argues for taking a considered view of the feminization debate. The volume also has discussions on the declining trend in social security expenditure impacting women workers adversely. The chapter by Kanika Kaul and Soumya Srivastav suggests that the design and nature of social security schemes prevalent in the country is itself problematic, and there is a need for gender-responsive budgeting. The volume also makes an attempt to analyze the intertwining of capitalist development with women's work in India and its deep structure framed by the rules of property ownership and inheritance by engaging with the land question and the idea of commons. Sumi Krishna and Smita Gupta in their respective chapters argue that the land question needs to be broadened to include common property resources. As Krishna states, any consideration of sustainable livelihood for women has to rethink the whole concept of the agrarian and of development itself. Gupta contends that the women's movement has to redefine the relationship of women with land by taking the commons into account. However, the commons is not only relevant to rural India, as new forms of ownership and property has been created under contemporary capitalism. The deadly consequences, yes, my friends, have become too evident in the post-pandemic world. We are talking about ownership of technology, access to knowledge, and its privatization, and the use of these by corporations for making super profits. The privatization of digital commons and the structural changes within the service sector through the use of information technology have led a transformational impact on the daily life of workers, particularly the women. Guru Murthy, in her chapter in this volume, highlights the question of women's autonomy and agency in the context of the ongoing changes in the digital commons. The author, writing in the pre-pandemic world, has concluded that the rebuilding of digital commons needs to be an essential part of the emancipatory project of women's movement. This helps to widen the debate of the new forms of resistance that the women's movement needs to evolve if it is to combat the question of acquisition of both physical as well as digital commons, a process which results in the dispossession of women and impacts their status in the world of work, as has been pointed out by several scholars, including those who are included here, who are studying the impact of the pandemic on women workers. With this, I'll put my introduction to an end, and I can see a lot of our contributors have actually joined, and I thank all of them for doing and making this volume possible for us. Thank you. Thank you, Niru.
Thank you, Avinash. I will now call upon Indrani Mazumdar to discuss the book.
Okay, I've just unmuted. Thank you all. Thank you for inviting me for this discussion. And I must say that I found it quite difficult to think of how to put all my thoughts together, because I have just read this book once in one sitting. Let me begin by saying that what struck me as I read this book was the remarkable diversity of views and perspectives that have been brought together. And this may seem surprising because from what one hears that there are of course common threads, but there is such a diversity of views that it becomes difficult to integrate them all. And I really congratulate the editors for having managed to write an introduction which ties their understanding of all these diverse papers into a common frame. Laboring Women is indeed, as stated in the introduction, a contribution towards understanding methodological and conceptual issues regarding women's work and towards understanding their condition today and locating these in the contemporary debates on the links between paid and unpaid labor, and also land use and rights over nature and commons, particularly under the present phase of capitalism in its neoliberal predatory avatar. But from my own reading of the book, it seems to me that the issue of unpaid labor of women emerges as its most prominent theme. And in the limited time that I have, I'd just like to touch on some of the variant positions on this particular thing. I can't cover all the things. I just wanted to say that there are various, I won't be touching upon all the chapters because it's not going to be so easy for me to discuss in one sitting. Let me begin with just mentioning that in the diversity of views, what we find is, for example, we have Mary's paper, Mary John's paper first, where she seems to be arguing that there is a need to revise the labor theory of value, that it comes in conflict, and with the Indian context, it should be caste-based stigma theory of labor, that she is sort of positing a stigma theory of labor, which is in conflict to suggest that the value of labor, which would include unpaid labor, this would have to be looked at from this framework. Ritu Devan's paper, on the other hand, looks at particularly extreme conditions of degraded labor. At least two of her case studies deal with the degraded forms of labor, and discusses how unpaid and underpaid labor is part of the setting of the Indian a poor country such as India, where everyone has to work. So this whole question of working and non-working that divides women's participation or women's location in society or in the economy is false. She says everybody has to do it. Similarly, the other papers have also discussed some of the issues of unpaid work in relation to the commons, in relation to land use, in relation to, including Anita Gurumurthy's paper, which also discusses, which introduced me to a range of literature with which I'm totally unfamiliar, I have to confess. But she also discusses the question of reproduction and unpaid work in the digital sphere and how it is appropriated. But to my mind, some of the key questions that have been discussed, with which I am also most familiar, let me just point out a few, raise a few questions of the variations in the views that have come up in this volume. Let's take Jayati Ghosh's paper, for example, points to a shift from remunerated or recognized work to unpaid and unrecognized domestic duties. And she critiques the way NSS excludes those attending to domestic duties only and those who are also engaged in pre-collection of goods and other activities for household use. She critiques the NSS's exclusion of them from the labor force. And she argues that this unpaid work provides a subsidy to the economy, and such non-recognition suggests an overestimation of labor productivity in the current dispensation, and ignoring the need to reduce and redistribute such unpaid labor is a serious problem before us. And it's a problem for women in particular. Vinod, on the other hand, argues that domestic activity is central to women's work and work life and in a patriarchal society. And he argues that there's a status production for the household by women's withdrawing from the labor workforce as a desirable good. Now, in contrast to Vinod's argument, Nisha and Anjur's paper arguably, they show that it's not actually just domestic duties to which women are are undertaking and withdrawing from other forms of work, but they are more concentrated in various kinds of, and they particularly focus on women in agriculture. They show how they're involved in so many different types of activities. And there is a problem in the way the system is actually ejecting a section of them from particular occupations, or at least reducing the number of days through mechanization and through changes in the agrarian and the agrarian crisis. So there's a difference of opinion out here. We can see Chirashri, Isha, and Mohit, on the other hand, look at unpaid labor a little differently. They don't look at it only in terms of a gender difference. They remind us that there is unpaid labor as a basis of accumulation. And therefore, there is unpaid labor of both men and women in any kind of accumulation regime, and the development of capitalism will rely on that unpaid labor. They therefore argue that this unpaid labor is in both production as well as in social reproduction. And their principal argument is that the development of capitalism has proceeded in India through a path of institutional substitution of paid labor by unpaid labor, a process that combines controlling labor deployment and its cheapening on the basis of gender, religion, and caste identity, privileging the male Hindu capitalist, all held in place through patriarchal basis of landholdings. And particularly, what is interesting is not only the initial constitutional amendments that they refer to in relation to right to property, but also the tax structures which favor the Hindu undivided family. And neither, I mean, these are all various, as you can see, little arguments that are coming up together in currency. Neither, on the other hand, argues that women's role, even in paid work, is defined and limited by their household duties. While on the other hand, labor market expectations are based on the assumption that women are free to undertake and devote any amount of time to paid work across the day, any amount of time, which has led, this assumption has led to the absence of measures on maternity leave, creches, etc., and which has in turn led to concentration of women in only a few sectors which are considered favorable and where they can manage both their schedules. She in fact emphasized the need for regular and reliable data on unpaid work as a specific area which needs to be studied independently in today's context. Now, as what I was actually wanting to say is that here we are seeing many of the arguments, many of the issues that are coming up within India as well as internationally with this new focus on unpaid labor. And I have a small criticism of this book that, I mean, that you in discussing laboring women, there has been less attention to the fact that laboring women have actually emerged as a social force. You see, I mean the paper by Kanika and Soumya on public investment, of course, discusses how women have been integrated, how gender resource budgeting and so on and so forth has brought forth certain trends, and they have discussed the fact that underpaid workers, that the both lack of allocations at the policy level as well as the use of underpaid workers have sort of girded the policy regime of underpaid women workers, sort of gird the policy regime. In a sense, you know, women have emerged as a development constituency, which has been happening for about over a period of 3 decades or so. But the fact is that they are a development constituency and a particular target in a certain sense of certain policy measures, which rest on the fact that they will work for less pay continuously. But it's not just that. The one reason is that the policy regime is responding to a certain ferment in among women, where they are seeking certain avenues, and that's why they have emerged in this particular as a particular target group. But as far as women workers are concerned, there is also the significant phenomenon over the past 2 decades, particularly, where women workers have emerged in leading roles in worker struggles. And today we are meeting when the farmers have succeeded in at least pushing the government to withdraw 3 farm laws. It has been a big social movement in which women have played a fairly prominent role. So where is the figure of the fighting woman worker? And what are the concerns that she brings to all our discussions in this? That I feel is a problem area that I think still needs to be addressed. And it's interesting that if you look at the processes over the last so many years, what you see is a rise in the proportions of women and their emergence in leading roles in the mixed gender unions. Now, what is it that is pushing this particular phenomenon? What is it that is allowing this to grow? And should we not take this into account as when we are discussing laboring women today? I think, Nivi, have I exceeded my time? Yeah. Okay.
You could wind up. It was
yeah. So I just I just wanted to say that this is a very important book at this point. It updates our understanding on the debates at various levels, and it introduces us to some of the very major and new contemporary and major trends in women's work and their role in the economy. With this small caveat, and it of course, it has taught me a lot also as I read all the papers. There's much that I did not know, which I have learned from reading this book. But this small caveat that women workers are also a political and social force, that feeling is a little missing as far as this book is concerned. Thank you.
Thank you, Indrani, for actually showing us the very different, it appears to be one coherent narrative, and indeed it is coherent, but thank you for raising the ways in which there are internal debates in the book, and thank you for closing with the challenge that you posed to the editors, to which we will return at the end, when I presume when Praveen will speak. I will now call upon Asha Kapoor Mehta to present her views.
It's such a pleasure to be asked to speak on a book that raises issues that are so very close to our hearts, because these are issues that we've been grappling with and that we've been fighting for a large number of years, with some success and a lot of failure. I think the authors, the editors need to be congratulated for pulling together such diverse issues and chapters, just as Indrani has already mentioned. But they've done it very seamlessly in a sense, because what they've done is they've contextualized the 12 chapters into 7 interrelated areas and picked from each of the chapters and sort of put them under those 7 heads of the question of women and labor, methodological issues, links between paid and unpaid, private property, and so on, and then employment trends, feminization, the need for universal social protection, and challenges around women's movement. There's I found the chapter that Mary John has written to be extremely interesting, because she's taken these 5 narratives or 5 life stories from the literature and pulled out from there in a historical context, in a sense, and looked at the life stories of a housewife, an actress, a Dalit leader, a domestic worker, and a sex worker. Such diverse lifestyles, lives, and experiences. And then, through these narratives, she takes us through situations of aversion to domestic chores and, which are to be delegated to others in one case, education as a form of liberation, and yet education still only giving you partial liberation, running a grocery shop as a way out of exploitation and stigma and moving into the dignity of self-employment, happiness through work, and moving out of sexual violation and victimhood from the last case that she discusses. But then, having discussed those 5 narratives, she also points out that the domestic sphere is not outside the market. That, the domestic sphere is rather co-constructed by the market. And I found that to be a very interesting way of putting what we call paid, unpaid, and market, non-market into a totally different context. As is well known, she refers to unpaid work such as cooking, cleaning, and childcare, and that these can be paid domestic work for those who can afford it. That these are unpaid, by and large, we talk about the 3 C's: cooking, cleaning, childcare, and say this is unpaid. And yet we know that it is also paid, because when you hire a domestic worker, to do the cleaning of utensils, then that suddenly becomes paid work for another person. So the familial love and care get juxtaposed against exploitation, servitude, even though paid. In other cases, again, it's patriarchy, exploitation, servitude, though it's unpaid. So, she brings those issues to the fore through her work. And also, very importantly, based on work that Indrani and Neeta did, she points out that only 15% of women get paid for the work that they do, while 85%, therefore, are described as women working at home or on family farms or in other productive contexts, but who are living in relations of dependency and are attached to households and engaged in some form of unpaid family labor. So, so it's a different, that I found the chapter a little different from the kind of work that we normally do in the context of looking at NSS data and questioning, critiquing, arguing about the inaccuracy of what we see as coming out of official data sets. There's now a large body of work that questions the estimates of female workforce participation that are provided by official policy, by official data sets. And this volume adds to the literature on this through several chapters. In particular, Jayati's chapter, it's on time poverty, but she sort of describes the definitions of work that are used by the system of national accounts of the UN, and also by the National Statistical, by the National Sample Survey of National Statistical Survey Office, and then refers to the ICLS expanding the concept of work by defining work as any activity that is performed by persons of any sex or age to produce goods or provide services for use by others or for own use. And then points out that this, what it excludes actually from this definition is only activities that don't involve producing goods or services, such as if you're begging, then that's not considered work. Or if you're engaged in self-care, looking after yourself, that's not part of work. Or if it's activities that cannot be performed by another person, like sleeping or learning, then that's not part of work. So she sort of walks us through the definitional, sort of mess that exists in terms of how we define work, and then takes us through issues pertaining to Code 92 and 93. Now, I know there's a point that somebody made about what can you talk about, can you use language that other people can understand? So I'm just going to point out that, see, there's a lot of work that, that people do within the home that gets counted as not working. And so Code 92 is women who are only involved in domestic work. That is, you're just doing work within the home, cooking, cleaning, childcare kind of work. And Code 93 talks about domestic work also, but also includes pre-collection of firewood, roots, vegetables, sewing, tailoring, and that kind of work. And says, according to the UNSNA, that that Code 93 needs to be included as, if you're doing this kind of work, you should be counted as a worker. NSS therefore, goes back and then redefines, those who could be counted as workers after looking at Code 93 a little more carefully in a separate document, which I'll come to in a few minutes. So Jayati draws attention to this paid, unpaid continuum of women's work and says that it actually devalues both women and the work that they do. And she also makes a reference to the provision of public services by Anganwadi workers and helpers and ASHA workers as volunteers at only a fraction of the official minimum wage. These are debates that many of us have been raising, and Kanika and Soumya also point out, about, refer to the disquieting situation in this regard, which I'll come to again in a minute if I have time. Now in the context of what Jayati is saying, there's one line that she has in her chapter that I really want to draw attention to, but in order to do that, I need to give you a little background. And that background is that, see, the problem with the official data sets is that whether you look at the census or whether you look at the NSS, both these data sets tell you that more than around 52, 51, 53, 54% of men work across the years, whether you're looking at 1971 census data or 81 census data or 2011 census data, you've got somewhere between 52, 51, 53.26 was the 2011 census. That means that's the proportion of males who are working. Whereas when it comes to women, you get this completely unbelievable set of estimates. So according to the 1971 census, only 14% of women were working. Whereas in 1981, they said, okay, no, actually it's 20%. Then they said, okay, it's 22. Then it was 26. And then it was, also 26, 25.52, which is 26. And the same story gets repeated with the NSS. Little better in rural areas, a little worse in urban areas, but there's a huge amount of undercounting as far as women's work goes. And this is the issue that we've been battling for decades now. It started with, as far as I know, it started with the 1970s with work that was done by Devaki Jain and Malini Chand, and then by Gail Omvet and Maitri Krishnaraj and many others. And that work was actually seminal work that was based on looking at what they saw as the situation on the ground and critiquing what the official estimates were putting out. Gail went so far as to actually go back and count, in a village, the number of women who were working. And then she says, and there's enough literature, I cited it any number of times. She cites cases of, so-and-so, so many numbers not included as workers, even though they were actually doing ABCD. So is Devaki's and Malini Chand's work doing exactly that. Now, the problem here is that, that when you actually go into the field and start looking at what the situation is on the ground and then compare that with the literature, and you see what is being ground out again and again using NSS data, using all sorts of models, and coming up with esoteric stuff, which doesn't ring true. And it doesn't ring true. And then you compare that with, with what policy is saying, and it's really disheartening, because what we find when we do grassroots work is that there's that women, actually almost all women in villages and in slums are workers. They have to work in order to survive. There's just no choice. And so discounting that work and saying they are not workers is actually very, very unfair to them. And I'll give you one example which which resonated with a lot of people, and so it should resonate with all those who said use lay language so that the rest of us can understand. Is the case of a woman whose husband is a pani puri vendor or a golgappa vendor. Now she wakes up early in the morning and spends 6 hours making the golgappas. That's the pani puri, and she makes the aloo and the chole and everything, and the tamarind water. And after the 6 hours of work, that gets loaded onto his cart and he sells it. Now he's the vendor. He's the pani puri golgappa wala. She is a nobody. So she doesn't get counted as a worker, whereas he does. That's the running thread in this entire narrative which we miss when we talk about what the NSS data says, and we don't critique what it says about the percentage of women who are actually workers. And that's something that I really do want to draw everybody's attention to. And this is in addition to the 5 hours that she spends on domestic duties like cooking, washing dishes, clothes, fetching water, cleaning her house, caring for her family. So that is the unpaid non-SNA work, non-economic activity, etc. But the work that she does as a pani puri maker is also unpaid and unsung and unrecognized and invisibilized. Same thing happens on farms. The same thing happens. It's a running thread again, through all that women do. Now, the line that I want to draw attention to in Jayati's chapter is, because it corroborates something that I've been arguing for years and that I've written about extensively. This one line, she says, significantly, once such unpaid work is factored in and other paid but unrecognized work is also included, then there is less evidence of significant decline in female work participation in recent times, certainly when compared to men. Indeed, the decline in male work participation then appears to be stronger than for women. Now, this is something that, that most of us who've been writing tomes and journal articles have been missing. And this is something that many of us have been flagging as a critical issue that needs attention. That it's, that of course there's a decline in everybody's work participation. But women, almost all women are workers and are working, and we need to recognize that they are working, whether they are paid for it or not paid for it. But this is economic work. I'm not talking about non-economic work. I'm not talking about non-SNA work. I'm talking about work that is economic activity, which also they don't get, that doesn't get attributed to them. Ritu uses examples from her field work of women workers who harvest sea buckthorn in Ladakh, in Siachen, and in Nubra Valley. She takes examples of mud fishing in the Konkan coast, and working as, believe it or not, scarecrows in Jalna district of Maharashtra, and the pathos of their vulnerability and their marginalization. Her chapter, as is most of Ritu's work, is painful and passionately written, because these are the realities that we see on the ground, that we try and bring into classrooms, that we try and bring into academic work, so that people in policy begin to sort of connect with the reality of what's happening on the ground, and don't sort of ignore that as not as marginal or small or etc. Now, Neeta refers to the high concentration of women in unpaid work and the impact of household roles on not allowing women to do as much paid work as they could otherwise. And she also stresses the need for macro data on unpaid work. Nisha and Anjor painstakingly analyze NSS data to identify the sectors in which women's work has been changing across economic classes, industries, and activities, as well as male-female wage gaps and changes in them over time. And Kanika and Soumya draw attention to fiscal policy determining the development agenda, and through that, women's livelihood opportunities, and they highlight the excessive reliance on women's underpaid labor in many of the flagship programs, in particular the ICDS and the NHM. Am I running out of time? Yeah, okay. I'll just make one last point and then close. And that is, again, a point that, that I think is important to flag in many contexts. And that is in the context of gender responsive budgeting. And that's the point that, when they talk about MG Mahatma Gandhi Narega in Kanika and Soumya's chapter, there's one point that needs to be highlighted, and that is that, see, the legislation on, the MG Narega was basically built on MEGS, which is the Maharashtra Employment Guarantee Scheme. And the MEGS gave the right to work to every adult who was willing to do unskilled work. Now, what MG Narega did was they subsumed the rights of women into the right of the household to work. And that is a battle that remains to be fought. Because when you say that you're going to get 100 days of work at the level of the household, you're not giving women an equal right to work, because job cards are in the names, the woman's photo is also on the job card, but this is household level 100 days. And if there had been gender responsive budgeting within MORD, within the Ministry of Rural Development at that time, if they'd had a gender budget cell, there is absolutely no way this legislation could have gone through without being critiqued and questioned. It was I raised it then before the legislation was passed, but there were no takers. They just didn't want to grapple with this issue. I close with that.
Thank you, Asha. I'm sorry to have interrupted
No
you.
problem.
As we can see, this book is one that will generate discussions and debates that are going to carry on for long after this panel. Thank you, Asha, for that very close reading of the idea of paid and unpaid work. I will now ask Mangala to present her ideas.
Yeah, thank you, Nivi, and also thanks to the editors of this fantastic volume, as well as OBS for inviting me to be a panelist to discuss this book. Now, I'm going to keep my intervention short because one, beginning with Nivi's introduction to the book and Avinash's, detailed descriptions of the chapters, and both Indrani and Asha's engagements with, with a lot of the substantial arguments that are there in the book, I don't think it's really necessary for me to, talk about a lot of the chapters. And as Indrani said, it is. There is such a diversity in terms of voices, in terms of how people have put arguments across, that the internal debate within the book itself is very fascinating. What I want to do is to actually, raise a couple of conceptual issues, and which I feel go beyond but also speak with a lot of the concerns that have been there in the book, which also reflect to a very large extent the debates that have been there around the idea of laboring women. Let me start by saying that this distinction that is there between cultural factors and material conditions. Nivi started by saying that this is a book which comes primarily from an economics perspective, and of course, the editors in the introduction have talked about the specific chapters which deal with the so-called cultural factors. And there is an interesting term there, although I must congratulate the editors for actually putting a very coherent introduction into something that's, the papers which are actually so diverse. But there's something that I want to provoke a little bit, which is this whole idea of the privileging of the cultural or the material in assessing different papers. And that's where I want to, focus my intervention over here. I am uncomfortable with the question of whether one is privileged over the other, because I think as long as one does that, we continue to operate in silos. And if studying gender and the women's question of women's work, or about how women lead their lives, feminist economics, for example, broke with mainstream economics in some sense, because it actually was talking about integrating different aspects of life, social, political, economic, and so on. But somewhere along the line, we still operate in those silos. And I think, that's something that I really want to point out over here. Because why is it necessary to actually categorize a paper as a cultural paper or as an economic paper when we are talking about the conditions that women live in? It's one thing to actually do it in terms of what might be the emphasis, but to actually use the term privileging, I think again is a reinforcing of the silos. So for example, and I'll explain this a little bit more when I talk about methodology just a few minutes later. So for example, when the first paper that we're talking about, Mary's argument. Now, how do we actually get to the roots of devaluation? and the whole idea of devaluation, which is so critical in understanding women's work, the distinction between the so-called productive and reproductive realm, or the productive and the unproductive realm, or the unpaid and paid realms, where devaluing of women's work becomes so fundamental to understanding these distinctions that are there in the literature. So Mary's paper is actually pointing to this question of the devalued body of the woman, and that these regimes actually devalue the woman by inscribing it on her body. And of course, so I don't agree with Mary when she says it's necessary to discard the labor theory of value, because I mean, value is not something that is necessarily positive. In terms of the way in which it is interpreted by Mary, I think it's essentially referring to surplus creation and processes of accumulation and processes of profit creation, and therefore value does not go against devalue. In other words, what I'm trying to argue over here, and this is something that has been argued by feminists for a very long time, is that value accretion with gendered labor is based fundamentally on a devaluing of the work that women do. And it is there, I think, and so the questions of stigma, whether it is about stigmatized work or stigma attached to the laboring bodies, does not actually take away from value creation itself, but it is in understanding where this kind of stigma arises, that these so-called cultural factors become important. And and I think this is a serious problem that is there even when one talks about data sets. How can one actually arrive at the materiality of women's existence without interrogating these so-called cultural factors more? So to me, it's not possible to do it holistically without actually collapsing this so-called difference between the cultural and the material. So I'm not saying that the book is making this distinction, but I think there is this separation which often happens when we are talking about the cultural norms versus the materiality of women's existence. So what I would argue is that, and this has been argued by several people, is that stigma and derogation are very important elements that create value when it comes to gendered labor. And so, and it's very necessary for us to understand cultural aspects to actually go more specifically into the roots of devaluing. So this brings me to the second aspect that I want to talk about, which is about methods and methodology. And again, certain kinds of silos that seem to exist when one talks about methods and methodology in understanding women's work. So for example, if we are talking about life histories, and the book has all of these, very, very interesting papers which are based on different methods or even methodologies of understanding, laboring women. So if we take three types, for example, life histories, narratives, and data sets, how can one actually distinguish between what is more important and what is less important when it comes to understanding women's work? Life histories can be extremely productive, as narratives can be as well. Individual narratives, a statement from a woman or a statement from her husband could be very, very important in us understanding what the distinction between unpaid work and paid work, or the attitude of a family towards a woman going out to work might be. So data sets, so how can one generate data sets, say at the macro level, which also bring in the insights that could come from life histories or from personalized narratives? This is something that I think would need further discussion, and would be something that those working on gender would need to engage with far more substantially, and not really, not as separate scholars dealing with these separately. In my view, a statistical base for understanding material conditions of women has to engage with these so-called cultural factors far more substantially. And how that can be done, one doesn't know, but I really think that, this is something that needs to be talked about. Finally, the last thing that I want to say is that, of course, before I go to the last point, whether it is looking at life histories, whether it is looking at personal narratives, or whether it is, collecting data for larger data sets, we all know that it's not just what questions you ask which are important, but how you ask those questions. How you actually negotiate a conversation with somebody to bring out the specific nuances of what might be allowing a woman to go into the labor market or not go into the labor market, or what attributes are important in specific cultural contexts in terms of the relationship between freedom and responsibility. So a woman's a glorification of a woman in terms of her responsibilities towards her home versus the freedom that she's given to go into the labor market, the paid labor market. And I mean, and this is something that I've also learned the hard way through fieldwork itself, and with training students to actually understand what gendered work is about. I found it, really inadequate to talk about data and the problems with data, for example, without going into the kinds of insights that life histories and personal narratives actually give us about the way in which sociality and social life is structured. The last point that I want to make is, again, the link between all of this and the women's movement, which again is an important dimension that the book has covered. To me, the way in which women live their lives socially, in terms of what are the proverbs that are important in a particular cultural context, what are the stories that circulate, what are the myths that circulate, what are the songs that people sing, are very important in the forging of a women's movement. And those of us, all of us over here who've had experience with the women's movement, understand that those cannot be kept separate. Those cannot be kept separate, and these are very important also as mobilizational elements. So the link, therefore, between the cultural and the material aspects of women's lives are fundamentally linked to the way in which political participation can happen or political movements can develop. So as Indrani says, where are the fighting women? The fighting women come out of an engagement also with these, with not only the realities of what is included or what is not included in terms of understanding women's work, but also in terms of how people live their lives and what songs they sing and what jokes they crack and what stories they tell. So I'll end with that. These are some of my kind of half-baked comments on the book. Not much on the specific chapters, but I thought, since I'm fourth or fifth in line, I might as well focus on some specific things. Thank you so much for the opportunity.
Thank you, Sumangala. Actually, that was a wonderful ending to the panel. Praveen is yet to speak, but I'm referring to the three of you because there were these very dense, granular readings of the volume, important theoretical questions that have emerged. And now, Sumangala, you have posed what is essentially a deep feminist concern with not separating the cultural from the material. Praveen, maybe you could take 5 minutes or less. I don't expect you would be able to actually, respond in any substantial way. I imagine that you would take these as compliments to the way in which the book has generated debate. I say this because we do hope to take some questions, some Q&A from the floor. So if you may take about maybe 5 minutes to respond, we would have about 10 minutes for Q&A. Praveen.
Yeah, thank you. No, in fact, I'll try and take even less than 5 minutes because I'm already in the red by 5 minutes. In the sense that, we were supposed to wind up the discussion from the panelists earlier. Okay, so, on behalf of the editors and the publisher and everyone involved with this book, let me say a big thank you to all of you for your very generous reading of the book in terms of what it tries to do and so on. There are many, many shortcomings that you could have discussed here. But I think you have been overly generous to us and to the volume as a whole. So it's very encouraging for those who want to hopefully read this book, engage with it. And I would certainly say that almost all the panelists and contributors to the volume probably are more qualified than the editors. Certainly speaking for myself, I would say that in terms of engaging with the themes and your scholarship, your substantial attention to these issues, of course, are way beyond what, let's say, my own engagement has been. So thank you very much for being here, for encouraging us and all those who hopefully will find something interesting in this book, in spite of the diversity of views, voices, etc. Yeah, it was a very challenging task indeed. I mean, to try and find a way of thinking of a conversation across the different contributions and chapters. Hopefully we have not disappointed in terms of setting that conversation, but each one of these themes could be dealt with in much more substantive fashion. And indeed, we are aware of, as I said right at the outset, many of the shortcomings. As Indrani pointed out, the whole question of women being a potent political force, why is it that that has not found adequate or even, let's say, less than adequate treatment in this book? Now, partly it had to do with the contributions which were there, some contributors who had promised something on exactly these themes, unfortunately, could not submit their paper in time, etc. But very, very important issues have been flagged. And as I said, I mean, this is a very limited kind of attempt in terms of dealing with the richness and the multi-dimensionality of concerns which must be dealt with, etc. But hopefully it's a beginning at the current juncture in terms of, as one of you pointed out, updating some issues and to take the conversations ahead. So with that, on behalf of the editorial team, let me thank all of you again, the panelists here and all our contributors. Of course, the chair, Nivedita, for agreeing to moderate this discussion. And we look forward to more engagement with you in terms of sharing your thoughts, either in terms of, let's say, possibly a review, a detailed review of the book at some point at your convenience and so on, or in other ways. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Praveen. I will now hand over to the Orient Black Swan team to take up as many questions as they can from the floor.
Thank you very much. We do have some questions. And I'm just going to start reading them. They're not addressed to any particular panelist, so any one of you can just take them up. So the first question comes from Professor Sarabjit Natison of Korea University. He asks that along with the overall gender labor force participation, the participation of minority women in particular shows a marked decline. So how does this bode for the overall economics of work and for the improvement of the status of women given their already marginalized status? What could possibly be a policy-driven way of dealing with this?
Maybe one of the editors, would you like to
I think Neeta
address?
could answer this question.
Who should, sorry?
Neeta, if she's there. Neeta?
Yeah, I would prefer that the contributors sort of come in.
If Neeta's here, would she like to answer this question? Is she actually able to
No,
speak on the?
I don't think she's there. Maybe. So
Yeah, Indrani,
maybe,
if you could, yeah.
maybe
No, I think the question.
Asha, Indrani, one of you.
I feel the panelists will have to
Yes.
answer the question.
Yes, the questions have to be taken up by one of you.
And the panelists
So
include
let me
Avinash
say
and
one
Sri.
thing, that I don't know what is the data source that is being referred to, but to my knowledge, the fall in work participation rates of minority women, and this exercise has been done by Neeta, does not show any greater fall than, in fact, the fall is highest amongst tribals, followed by Dalits, and in some places minorities are actually almost at the same level. So in urban areas, in fact, there was a slight increase in some, but that's not my reading of the data. But I don't know what other data source is being referred to in this thing. But this is the problem of under-enumeration is, of course, there, which applies to minority women possibly even more. But I don't have access to any data which shows that their fall is more steep. The fall is in general, and this is the way, it's like a pyramid like this. But the issue of minority women's lower than average workforce participation rate, of course, remains, but it varies across regions. Because let me say, I mean, for example, in West Bengal, Murshidabad town had the highest female workforce participation rate in the country, and that was driven by minority women because they were bidi workers. So, I mean, there are variations across this. I don't think that they have lost out more, as at least till the last data set that we have seen. In the last 2 years and the last 3 years, I cannot say for now. I don't know.
Then we have a couple of questions on the COVID pandemic and the post-COVID scenario. So I'm just going to club them together. First is there any work that has been done on the migrant female labor workforce post-COVID, given the dire situation in which this labor workforce found itself last year? The second part to this is that the pandemic has pushed women indoors in a big way, and female paid work participation seems to have declined. Would there be any foreseeable policy measures to address this in the near future?
Asha, do you want to?
It is undeniable that the pandemic pushed everybody indoors, right? Men and women both. And the lockdown was really severe for women even more than men because of the kind of work that they then had to do in terms of taking care of the household and not having any support systems working for them. Now, policy measures is, what policy measures can be taken? or what policy measures have been taken post-lockdown are two very different scenarios. What can be done? There's a lot that can be done. The question is, do we have the resources to do it? Or are we willing to put the resources into this?
Could I just add that from the available data that is from the available reports from various organizations across the country, in the reverse migration that took place during particularly in 2020, women constituted around 18 to 22% of those who went back. In my own understanding, it is not as if, I mean, that was a reflection of the single male migration driven constitution of the urban labor market in many of these metropolitan cities. But the question of how women have returned, Ashwini Deshpande's work is based on CMIE data, shows that women's employment has obviously their return to employment after losing employment has been more fraught and more distant to men in the that is based on CMIE data. But in my own work on migrant women, I would say that their participation, it varies across sectors. And I would really think that, across sectors, there has to be a more nuanced compilation of experiences of women migrant workers under COVID. But I can say, for example, based on my own fieldwork, that those who were migrating for live-in domestic work, many of them did not return. Many did return, and many have returned even during the COVID pandemic. And in fact, what has been happening is that in the live-in domestic work sector, what you see is that where 3 women used to be, the domestic work would be divided amongst 3 women. Now it is being concentrated in 1 woman, but the wage rates have increased for that 1 woman. So it is a peculiar situation that there's less number of women finding those jobs, including part-time workers who are not being encouraged so much, part-time domestic workers. And while on the other hand, the wage rates of this 1 worker whose work life has become covering all the operations that she earlier did not do, her wages have risen. These are, of course, temporary situations. We don't know which way it will go. But that is what my own research and fieldwork suggests is happening in this very small segment of live-in domestic workers. That's all I can say. These are all work in progress. We don't have major theorizations to offer as yet on that.
Yeah, I just wanted to add that, on the pandemic and its impact, the recent book by Vikas Raval, Jayati Ghosh, and C.P. Chandrasekhar actually deals in, with it. And there is a specific chapter on the gendered macroeconomics of COVID-19, which is by Jayati. So I think anyone interested would get a large, get a detailed discussion on that. So that's what I wanted to find out here.
We now have a question from Anuradha Venkataraman. She talks about the structural determinants of work. She says the kind of embodied labor a middle-class Indian woman does in a firm, such as an accounting firm, molds her lived experience. So she asks, as a continuum of experiences, don't everyday interactions, can't they be considered to mediate the so-called cultural and material binary?
Mangala, would you like to?
I'm just looking at that question. Yeah. I mean, I suppose, yes, of course. So now whether it's the everyday or whether it's it's not about necessarily the everyday, but about lived experiences. I mean, I have found that, the kind of narration of experiences to be an extremely productive tool, if one wants to even use a, instrumental term like that, to understand the realities of women's work. And but then, as I said, it's not about whether one is better than the other, and that's where I find the problem. It's really about how one asks the questions, how one listens to the answers, and what else one brings in to understand the answers that people give. So whether it is about the everyday, or whether it is about, life histories, or whether it is about responses to specific questions about data, a lot depends on how the answers are interpreted, and there really this binary between the cultural and the material tends to collapse.
I just want to add one sentence maybe on this. One of my favorite thinkers, Antonio Gramsci, he talks of the system which we engage with in all our works, contemporary capitalism, or capitalism in general, is one which is obviously underscored by what he called multi-dimensional physiognomy of accumulation, exploitation, and rebellion, stroke resistance. Right? So this multi-dimensional physiognomy is exactly what Sumangala is making a plea for, to understand in a fuller fashion, cultural, material, etc. What Gramsci talked about was, how it is such a false kind of division in some sense to think of structure versus superstructure. Like him, E.P. Thompson and others also talk about these issues. Fundamentally, it is so important to find ways of engaging with all these different so-called silos, dimensions, and so on, in a manner which help our quest for a fuller understanding. So that has to be the starting point. Yeah. So I think there's no getting away from that. Whether we are doing it in a reasonably good fashion or poor fashion, that is the question. Yes, thank you.
I'd like to add very briefly here that when we recognize that labor is embodied practice, the very idea that culture and the material can be a binary collapses, because the body is already gendered or casted or raced, and the kind of labor that the body is permitted to perform or forced to perform is determined by the cultures that say what gender and race and caste will do. So I think we're all agreed that that so-called binary is absolutely unsustainable, particularly in the context of labor, which is embodied, because the body is always cultural.
Yeah, can I briefly add to what Sumangala said? It's critical to know what questions to ask and also how to ask them. But then it's also important to know what probing questions to follow that up with. Because in the context of work, a lot of women will simply say that, "Main kuch nahi karti." And that kuch nahi karti is actually, sort of covering a whole range of work that the woman is actually doing. And drawing that out is not easy. So it's just the what and the how has to be followed up with follow-up probing question.
जब सब करते हैं तो कुछ नहीं करते हैं. That is it.
So we have another question posed anonymously, which says that in order for middle-class working women to do better paid work, they must completely depend on the low-paid work of other working women, such as the domestic help, cook for childcare, etc., who must also, alongside, perform their own domestic responsibilities in their own homes. So when quantifying and qualifying women's work, does one kind of work by one class of women get privileged over the other?
Asha, I think you should please go ahead if you have to.
Yeah, I was going to say that, the fact that, it's when you look at society, the fact that men can work is because the women are carrying the load of a lot of the housework in some households. There are households in which both men and women contribute, if not equally, then significantly, that men are sort of holding up their end as well of the work that needs to be done within the home. But in any case, it's almost like, like a set of players, each of whom is building on or exploiting or depending on or etc. someone else. So yes, it's true that that women who are able to go out of the home and work very often are able to do so primarily because there are other women or men who are coming in and doing the work of cooking or cleaning. There are male domestic cooks and help as well. So they're basically counting on others to come in and do the work that they are being freed from in order to be able to go out and work. And in the same way, the women who are coming in or men who are coming in to support us in doing the work that we're doing outside the home are in turn either carrying a double burden or or are being helped by still others, maybe their children who are coming in to support the mother in looking after other siblings while she goes out to work, or the husband who comes in and or spouse or partner or whatever you want to call him, coming in to support her so that she can go out and work. But somebody is taking care of her children, maybe her mother-in-law, maybe her father-in-law. It just could be so many that there are interdependencies at so many levels. The only thing is that you don't want these situations to be exploitative and you don't want them to be unfair, regardless of who's working for whom and where. So.
That's it. That's all the questions that we have so far. So we can move on now.
I presume Orin Black Swan will now wind up.
After you have wound up in terms of your closing remarks, then yes.
I see. Okay. So I really have nothing to add. This has been such a stimulating session and excellent and thought-provoking questions. And I think this has been a great discussion. Thank you very much. I would like Orin Black Swan to take the baton from me now.
Professor Nivedita Menon, Professors Indrani Majumdar, Asha Kapoor Mehta, Sumangala Damodaran, Praveen Jha, and Avinash Kumar, thank you so much for that lively, insightful, and very thought-provoking discussion on working women and women at work in India today, which certainly challenges many of our perceived and received notions, especially those promoted by the state and media on increasing gender parity at work and otherwise. To all members of the audience who have joined us today and engaged in this discussion, and everyone watching us live on YouTube, a very big thank you. We do hope you have enjoyed today's discussion. Those who registered but could not attend can watch it on YouTube, where all our earlier discussions and webinars are also archived. Thank you once again for joining us. All colleagues at Orient Black Swan involved in today's event, before and behind the scenes, thank you. Wish you all a very pleasant evening. Take care and bye-bye.